This is Clark the Knife, and this is the Jack Wolf Knives Sharpshooter Jack. Now, this is a little bit different than a lot of the other knives that I review on my channel. First off, Jack Wolf Knives manufactures all of their knives over in China. I am not categorically opposed to knives made in China, but as you've probably seen, most of the knives I review are either made in the US or done by US-based companies. Not that Jack Wolf is not a US-based company, it very much is. And then second, as you saw, this is a slip joint. That is a pattern that comes with some major pros, some cons. We'll talk about those in detail. If you've been anywhere around the knife community, especially sort of the online, the Instagram, Facebook part of it, things like that, you no doubt have seen these Jack Wolf knives floating around. I will say, I bought this one with my own money. Most of the reviews of Jack Wolf knives that you've seen floating around YouTube have been loaners, pass-arounds, things like that. Jack Wolf Knives is very aggressive with their marketing. I don't say that in a bad way. I say that they have very much figured out how to build hype around a brand in 2024. So we're going to sort of cut through that hype a little bit and review these knives just as knives from the functional perspective that I generally take. I go through my reviews in 3 sections. First, we're going to go through some specs, then we're going to look at this knife tip to tail, talk about what it's like to use, and then finally we're going to give it some scores. And then finally, I am trying to grow this channel, so if you get some value out of this, then do like, do subscribe, leave some comments down below. It does help out. I am going to start asking for that because it does seem to matter, and people do it a little bit more when you ask, as cringy as it feels. So, let's get to some specifications here. The Sharpshooter Jack. This is the second one of the second batch of the Sharpshooter Jack. So Jack Wolf Knives sort of does all of their knives in something that is like a flash batch or a sprint run, where they will release 4 or 5 variations on the knife all at the same time. They'll be around until they sell out, and then they either won't release that pattern again, or will release that pattern again sometime in the future with some differences. So the Sharpshooter Jack was the first knife that Jack Wolf Knives ever came out with. I actually bought a micarta version way back when. This version here is the updated version with S90V steel and with these fat carbon overlays. This is full titanium here. Again, S90V. This blade, like most of their blades, has a hand rub satin finish. If we go through our specifications here, again, these are made in China. The maker that Jack Wolf uses, the OEM, I have not seen it officially confirmed anywhere, which means that it's one of the 2 or 3 OEMs that tend to prefer to have their identity obscured. You know, could be React, could be Best Tech. I'm sure it's been confirmed somewhere, but I don't know specifically, and I'm not going to speculate. These retail for, I've seen them for $2.99, I've seen them for $3.25. I think these days most retailers are going to have them at $3.25, but wait a little bit and you can often find some of them at $2.99. And I've definitely seen these at $2.99 right now. This is a 3.23 inch blade that is 118 thousandths thick, which is relatively thin. This blade again is S90V. Sort of their first year of production tended to be an M390, but now they are pretty much exclusively making their knives in S90V. 7.35 inches overall, 2.9 ounces, so fairly light, and it is a slip joint. Let's do some quick size comparisons. As you expect for a slip joint, this is not a big knife compared to your Benchmade Bugout, and you can see the Benchmade Bugout looks large compared to the Sharpshooter Jack here, which, by the way, I am probably going to accidentally call the Gunslinger Jack at least once during this review. Here's your small Sabenza. You can see very similar in overall size to that small Sabenza. And the reason I might call it the Gunslinger is Jack Wolf Knives does offer some locking knives now. They're locking knives, you know, again, slip joint, no lock here. Lock is on, well, it's not really a lock, but you got your spring along the back here. Their locking knives follow the same patterns as their slip joints, but they just have a lock. They also tend to be a little bit larger. And the Gunslinger is the locking version of the Sharpshooter. Compared to the TRM Neutron here, very similar in size to the Neutron, a little bit chunkier in the blade, a little bit chunkier in the handle, a little bit heavier, but, you know, still that sort of small EDC size. Let's compare it to your PM2. And you can see you're significantly smaller than your PM2, as you might expect based on those other comparisons. And then one more, your Delica here. You can see the Delica, another small knife, but this is still even a little bit smaller than the Delica in overall length, while again being a little bit chunkier, a little bit heavier. So, this again is a slip joint. That means there is no lock, and if you put enough force on the back of the blade here, it will just snap down like that. Back spring right here. To go through the usual slip joint stuff, you've got your little fuller here, which gives you plenty of purchase to grab. Pull that. You got a half stop right there. It is flush in that half stop position. Pull it, nice snap on the open. Probably most people put these at about a 7 out of 10 on a spring tension. Nice and flush in the open position. Nice and flush on the half stop. Nice and flush on the closed position. Very well manufactured, as these Jack Wolf knives always have been. And even when you have this open here, even though it is not locking, you have to push. I'm pushing pretty hard with my thumb right here, and it's just bowing. It is not actually closing. So as is typical with most Jack Wolf knives, this is a pretty stiff spring, and it's pretty stiff, especially in that open position. So it is still a slip joint. You still don't have an actual lock, but I have felt comfortable pushing this a little bit harder than I typically would push a slip joint. Because obviously with a slip joint, the problem of not having a lock is anything that either you stick the blade into and you're sort of, you know, let's say you stick it into a bag and you're wiggling it around, it might fold on you there, or anytime that you're sort of trying to really push and you might put pressure on the back of the blade, that could also be an issue and cause that slip joint to close on you. The lighter the spring is, the more that risk is. This is a pretty heavy-duty spring. Blade here. This is a very traditional clip point style. And like most Jack Wolf knives, it is a very pretty blade. Very nice, subtle fuller here. I mean, I guess you call that a nail nick. I'm not generally a slip joint guy, so I apologize if some of my terminology is not quite what people typically use in this scenario. But straight all the way across the back here, you've even got a nice satin finish on the spine there. It tapers very quickly once you get into that clip point. You can see a nice little fuller there on the, or not a fuller, a nice little swedge there on the clip point, just for some visual interest. And I guess it does thin out the blade a little bit. Gets very, very thin toward that tip. And then, as with most Jack Wolf knives, maybe all, you can see especially on the plunge there, this is a hollow ground blade. And 118 thousandths on the stock, which is not that thick to begin with, comes down very, very thin behind the edge. You can sort of see if you look, let me see, that's probably the easiest way to do it. If you look like that, you can sort of see the edge almost disappears there. These are very, very sharp, very slicey knives. Now, the one thing that I will say is the edge geometry is great. It is simply very, very thin behind the edge. It's probably one of the thinner behind the edge knives that I've had. And honestly, that's what got a lot of the hype around Jack Wolf knives, especially when they were coming out last year. People got super excited about how screamingly thin behind the edge these blades were. You know, folks like Neves Knives and stuff like that were measuring them and getting 10 thousandths behind the edge, which is the sort of thing that you typically don't see in production knives in 2023 or 2024. I will say that this blade does not slice as well as I would expect given that crazy edge geometry, which really just comes down to the factory sharpening job. These slice very, very well. This is going to be one of the slicier knives in your collection, but it doesn't quite have that insanely glassy, insanely smooth cutting performance that you might expect from such aggressive edge geometry. Now, if you're really good at sharpening, lay that edge back a little bit, clean it up, and it will probably be a complete slicing beast. And in any case, it's still very, very sharp. It still bites very, very well. And the blade stock is thin enough that even if you pass this through cardboard, pass it through any material, rugs, carpet, extended cuts through twine, anything where you're dragging that blade through the material, this blade is thin enough that it's not going to hold you up. But I will say this edge geometry is very visually impressive, and it is impressive what they have done with the grind at a production scale. I've said in some of my other reviews, it's sometimes frustrating in 2024 with how sort of fat grinds tend to be. It's one of those questions of like, sort of why aren't grinds a little bit more aggressive in the production scale? This really does show that at moderate production volumes, these are hundreds of knives per batch, you can get these screamingly thin grinds, which is pretty cool. And as for the blade shape, as with most clip points like this, most sort of Bowie style clip points, functionally this is a drop point that just looks a little bit cooler. As I say about drop points in general, the big, long, flat, little bit of curve toward the tip, this is a blade shape that is very good for just about everything and exceptional at pretty much nothing. Your tip is pretty much even with the pivot here because the knife is so small. It is relatively easy to get that tip down for your drag cuts, your utility cuts, things like that. It is a long enough blade, again 3 1/4 inches about, that you can drag this through material. It feels, encroaching on sort of what you can do with a full-size knife. You don't feel limited by the size of this blade, nor do you feel limited by the shape of this blade. And it happens to be a very, let's get this in the light here, a very, very pretty rendition. Let's see if I can get a little bit more of that. No, I'll just do it like this. A very pretty rendition of the clip point here on that blade. And honestly, the nail nick is very tastefully designed as well. One other thing that's cool about the hollow grinds on these Jack Wolf knives, even though they have the nail nick, the hollow grind is aggressive enough if you can kind of see, you see how aggressive it swoops in. It's a bit hard to focus, but how aggressively it swoops in behind that spine. You can actually just pinch it on the spine, sort of grab that hollow and pull it just like that without even going into the nail nick. That is another benefit of that hollow grind. It does make opening even a little bit easier. So, great functional blade. Might not be quite as insanely slicey as you might expect given the geometry, but still very, very slicey. Which brings us to the handle. And Jack Wolf Knives handles are really, really well executed. Whoever their OEM is does a fantastic job. And I know, I forget the guy's name, but the guy behind Jack Wolf Knives, he mentions that there's quite a bit of hand finishing on these, and I could totally see that given how flush everything is. I'm sure this probably goes through a pretty heavy hand sanding pass and hand contouring pass on everything before it goes out the door. So you've got influenced by a lot of traditional patterns here. This is basically a gun stock pattern where you've got a little thin part up here and then it fattens toward the back. Obvious reason it's called a gun stock pattern. Nice bead blast on your bolster and sort of your tail cap or your end cap here. Does not pick up snails quite as much as something like a CRK. This is a bead blast, not a sand blast. So it will get some snails as you use it, but it doesn't immediately pick up snails like something like a Chris Reeve. You got 3 nice little grooves right there. Visual do provide a little bit of tactile grip there, but not that much. Another single groove back here. Again, sort of nice little tributes to some traditional patterns. You've got a very nice chamfer right here, which is actually quite functional. As you pinch up on this blade, you can get right on that chamfer, use it to grip the blade just like that. This is a grip that's very easy to use this knife in. Again, everything is flush along the spine here. You've got a very nice curve all the way along the back. And then you have these beautiful, I mean, they're really covers more than inlays here because they go right flush to the edge. And these here are in, I forget the name of this fat carbon, but a particular fat carbon, which is carbon fiber inlaid with resins in different colors. And especially when you get a lightly contoured surface like this, which this is, this whole thing is lightly contoured. It really shows off these very cool kind of emergent patterns that just happen as you cut through the layers of that fat carbon. It is very cool. It definitely pops. I really like when they get these sort of reds and whites in the fat carbon. It's just a very cool looking cover. They have finished it kind of matte, so it's not slippery. It's not grippy, but it's not slippery either. And it's just sort of become part of Jack Wolf's identity now, bringing these fancy carbon fibers or fancy materials like Kiranite, all sorts of other stuff. They used to use lots of micarta. They've sort of moved away from that. I kind of wish they would go back to micarta, but that's neither here nor there. You can get lots of different looks for your Jack Wolf knife just based on whatever inlay they put in here, or I guess, again, cover they put in here. Again, everything very, very nice and flush along the back here. There's a nice rounding off, a very subtle rounding off across these edges here. Very nice chamfers on the back. And again, I already spoke about this one in the front. The other side is identical to the front side. Again, this is a slip joint, so there's no real show side and lock side because there's no lock. Functionally, this gun stock pattern is really comfortable in the hand. So as is typical for a gun stock pattern, you got your front two fingers gripping right on this skinny part, and then your back two fingers on this fatter part, and this little notch right here actually keeps your sort of middle finger in place and does help keep this thing in your hand. One of the benefits of a lockless slip joint knife like this is you don't need your handle to accommodate lock geometry because everything is right in your back spring right back here. So this handle is very small and very nicely rounded. And it's, totally ambidextrous. Rolling into sort of the bottom of your knuckles here, it fits very, very neatly right on these knuckles. And honestly, especially for more delicate tasks, and again, this is a slip joint, you're not going to be driving through a car door like this. Very comfortable in the hand. This is the grip I'd use, breaking down cardboard, stuff like that for larger tasks for a slip joint. And because of the way this little gun stock notch is done, because of the subtle contouring, and then because of the big flats you got on the top and the bottom, this feels quite secure in the hand. It doesn't want to move. I post my thumb up here. There's no jimping or anything like that. But especially with the bead blast here, with the matte finish, and again, with these big flats that roll into your knuckles and your palm, this does feel quite secure in the hand. I do like how much they kept this squared off. It helps make it feel much more secure. And I think that sort of blocky look it gives is also visually very nice. The other great thing about a slip joint, very simple design like this, very easy to climb up and down. Slip joints you're very often going to use in some kind of pinch grip like this, where you're grabbing the blade, getting very, very close, getting close on detail, getting around things, into things, really using that super slicey, super pointy tip and that super slicey edge to get little things that you want to cut, little bits of twine, zip ties, little pieces of, plant material if you're out in the garden, stuff like that. Very easy to navigate this blade wherever you need to. It just ends up being a very pleasant, very natural knife to just pick up and use. It kind of feels a little bit like a small Sebenza in that way, in that it is a neutral design, but it's a neutral design with a little bit of curvature to it, with a little bit of extra nooks and notches to it, things like that. And as a result, it ends up being a design that is comfortable in pretty much any grip while still being secure. The only time that this knife does sort of show how much it's a neutral design is I have tried to push it into a little bit larger tasks, like breaking down a bunch of boxes, things like that. And the fact is, this is still a small knife in the hand. This is still a small knife, in your knuckles. And there isn't that much, these two fingers, they're anchored against rolling back, and these two, sort of don't want to roll forward. But there's not that much of this knife that is really holding your hand in place that much. So as you start to push this harder, and especially as you start to use this for tasks where you're getting more resistance as you cut, tough cutting through carpet, cutting through, double, triple walled cardboard, cutting through rougher plant material, dirt, stuff like that. It will start to feel like you're kind of just gripping a stick, and you will get some hand fatigue, or at least I have, where you feel like you have to grip onto the knife, you have to hold onto the knife because the knife is not really holding you back. Now, the question is a slip joint really meant to be used in those circumstances anyway? And I think, frankly, you can make a decent argument no, that by the time you would get to those places where you'd be fatiguing your hand, you're moving into territory where you'd want to use a locking knife anyway. I also anticipate, frankly, that most people, when they're carrying a Jack Wolf, first off, they're pretty much all knife enthusiasts. And second, most of you are probably carrying a second larger knife at the same time. Or you're carrying this on a day like to the office or something like that where you know the only things you're going to need your knife for are relatively light duty tasks. So I don't hold out against the ergos all that much because I'm asking it to do something it is very clearly not meant to do. Within those light, fine, agile tasks that a slip joint is really meant to do, this grip works very, very nicely. So that's, and then you've got satin hardware, satin screws here. Not really recommended to take apart your slip joint. It's just a bit of a pain in the butt to get the spring to go back together properly and all that stuff. Actually, it's a little bit more than a pain in the butt. It's quite difficult from what I've heard. I have not tried, but I will say that action has been fantastic out of the box. Has just gotten even a little bit smoother with time. All I've ever had to do in terms of maintenance is put a little oil, a little KPL in that joint, and I've seen no need to take this apart. So with all that said, let's get to some scores. And overall, I do like quite a lot of what, and I forgot, quite a lot of what Jack Wolf Knives is doing here. So, the fun factor, Jack Wolf Knives really does have the fun factor of what people are looking for in a knife in 2024. They do have that really nailed down. Not just with the Sharpshooter Jack, but with quite a lot of their designs. They are very, very fun knives. They are very cool knives, and they really do understand a lot of things that make knife enthusiasts tick and cater to those very well. Blade design. This is a beautiful rendition of a clip point or a Bowie style blade in a very nice hand satin with a very aggressive hollow grind. So it's super slicey while still having satisfyingly thick stock. It's got a beautiful surface finish and it's a cool and distinctive design. That's an A as much as any blade design is going to be. I mean, even the way that they cut their little plunge here and cut their little sharpening choil, it's just a little bit cooler than it has to be. Really nice etching on the S90V and the Jack Wolf, even in sort of a slightly unusual font. There's nothing, all their blade shapes, with the exception of a couple like the Cyborg Jack, are traditional blade shapes, but kind of like how I talk about how Hinderer takes traditional blade shapes and makes them look really, really cool. Jack Wolf Knives does the same thing, and every single blade design that Jack Wolf has done has been a very cool rendition of whatever it's doing. The Sharpshooter here is no exception, and frankly, I think it's one of their best, solid A. Handle design. Again, visually looks very, very nice. A nice modernized rendition on the gunstock pattern, with your, the bead blasted contrast with the carbon fiber. Very, very pretty. Nice, subtle curves everywhere. This might be straight, but a lot of stuff is very close to straight without being straight. Nice contour all the way across the handle here. It's a subtle contour, but it definitely makes a difference with the ergos. Definitely makes it feel more premium. And all the little details, like the way they did this front chamfer, these little bars here, and then just how well everything is put together. This is a very premium looking, very premium feeling handle. Everything is just tight and solid, and again, it really does fit the vibe that Jack Wolf Knives is going for, which is something that clearly has that traditional heritage, but distinctly feels modern. Like, this does not feel like a old-timey knife made to modern standards. This feels like a modern homage to some of those traditional pattern designs. It's very distinctive. There's nobody that quite feels or looks like Jack Wolf Knives out there in the market. And that's cool. So that's an A. Action. I'm not a huge slip joint guy, so it's not like I have a comprehensive understanding of slip joint actions. But I will say, both from a functional perspective and just a satisfaction perspective, this is a very good slip joint action. I love how stiff it is in the open position, because again, I can push this harder than a lot of other slip joints I've handled, because I don't really feel like it's going to close on me. Realistically, the only way that this would unintentionally close would be if I jammed it into something and sort of like pulled or twisted or something like that. Tried to pull it up and it was stuck in something. I'm never going to put my thumb on this back hard enough to really close this blade accidentally. And then the action is just very satisfying to pull. The walk and talk, the acoustics are fantastic. Really, really satisfying. It gets that same sort of tactile, very heavy duty, very clickety clackety feeling that you get with the very best backlocks, and so it represents an extremely good rendition of what a slip joint action should be in 2024, and it's been smooth since the day I got it. Solid A. Fit and finish. Everything is done extremely well for a production standard. Whoever the OEM is, again, I suspect it's probably Riat or Best Tech. They definitely are doing a good job. This hand satin is very nicely done. A very nice satin finish on the back here. All of your grinds, all of your cutouts, things like that are very precise, very sharp. Everything is extremely nice and flush on that handle. And again, all the little details everywhere, like the fact that they did contour this. It is, flush in all three positions. How well that etching is done. It's just a very, very nicely finished production knife. Solid A in fit and finish there. Absolutely nothing to complain about anywhere on this knife or any other Jack Wolf that I've handled. And the cool factor, frankly, I don't even know why I gave that an A-. The cool factor for Jack Wolf knives is a solid A, and honestly, if you consider the whole package, what Jack Wolf Knives has managed to do is basically manufacture what almost feels like an A+ in cool factor with everything else that they have done. And if you've seen any Jack Wolf Knives reviews, you've seen this whole thing, like the fact that you get the tin with custom artwork from Sean Tiffany, that you get the rag, you get the slip, and you get these very, very interesting designs that don't look like anything else. That with every single release, you've got a bit of that hype factor. And every time you release one, you've got 4 or 5 different choices. They'll sell at a different rates based on what's popular. And then you won't be able to get them again. He used to sell regularly. Now he's increased his production, so usually it's not so hard to get one. Maybe if 5 things come out, 1 or 2 of them will sell immediately. The rest you can still get for a couple weeks. But anyway, between Jack Wolf Knives' social media presence, between their branding, their packaging, the way that they roll out their knives, everything about it is really just doing everything that is cool in the online knife community in 2024, doing it all very intentionally and doing it all very, very well. And that is how he has taken a brand from nothing to a brand that can sell out hundreds of knives every single month in the span of less than 2 years. It's really, really impressive, and it is absolutely a testament to how cool these designs are. Like, even just looking at the knife itself, regardless of that packaging, regardless of the story, the social media presence, all that, if you are used to modern knives but you are slip joint curious, this is a better on-ramp for slip joints for knife nuts and for sort of very online knife people than anything else on the market. If you go to your GECs or you go to those more traditional slip joint brands, you're getting heritage, you're getting exclusivity, but you're not getting that super tight fit and finish. You're not getting that modern design. You're not getting, some of those fancy materials, things like that quite as much. Here you get everything that most of us think is really, really cool in modern knife designs, and you get it in a slip joint package, which is less common, with these very aggressive blade grinds, which are just something that people find cool right now. overall, the cool factor on, I think the Sharpshooter Jack is one of the cooler looking Jack Wolf knives out there. A couple of them admittedly look a little dorky. This one just looks sleek and sort of mean, especially with this red and white fat carbon in it. It's a solid A in cool factor, and if you're the sort of person that really cares about packaging, if you're the sort of person that really cares about, you know, stuff that looks good on social media presence, things like that, if you're really big on the brand, this could frankly be an A+ cool factor. And you see people that have become raving Jack Wolf fans, raving Jack Wolf collectors, again, for a brand that has only been around for a couple years. It's really impressive what the brand has managed to do to elevate itself so quickly. And honestly, just from a business perspective, I am very, very impressed by what Jack Wolf Knives has done. And frankly, that's part of the reason that I want to, play around with these, that I want to review these. It's not that they lack for attention. I'm not bringing any new attention to them, but I do really appreciate how well the company has looked at the knife market, looked at what makes things sell in 2024, and very deliberately done all of those things to really maximize the success of these knives. Something a lot of other companies, especially sort of up-and-coming smaller companies, could learn from. So it's a solid A in fun factor. This thing is made for knife enthusiasts. It checks all the boxes of what knife enthusiasts want in 2024. Function. Cutting performance is still an A. It's not an A+. This hollow grind, again, gets very, very thin behind the edge. The blade stock 118,000, I'm totally fine with that. I wouldn't want it any thinner than that. I actually agree. The brand has said that they think that that would sort of diminish the aesthetics a little bit and diminish the overall feel. I mean, this is kind of a chunky feeling slip joint, and I do agree. And with a hollow grind this aggressive, I don't think they needed to shrink the blade stock. The fact is, it cuts very, very well. It is extremely slicey. It is not the sliciest knife in my collection. And with this hyper-aggressive grind, and with some of the hype that you might have heard about Jack Wolf knives, you might think that these things are insane slicers. This one, in my experience, and frankly in my experience with Jack Wolf knives in general, especially with the factory edge, it's not an insane slicer. It is a very, very good slicer. It's on the level of a really well-sharpened bug-out. Not a stock bug-out, a really well-sharpened bug-out. It's on the level of a TRM Neutron. I would put it significantly below the sliciness of something like a Delica or a Dragonfly or something like that. So it cuts very, very well. But that's it. It's very, very well. It's a solid A, but I think a lot of people, maybe because of how thin this grind gets behind the edge and because of how cool it is to get a hollow grind on already thin stock, it's what a lot of people say they want. I will say the cutting performance by itself does not justify any hype. The blade is very cool because of how aggressive that grind is, but it's not like you're going to get insane cutting performance out of it. Still very good, still a solid A. Utility. It's hard for me to give a slip joint anything more than a B for utility. This handle, as I mentioned in the grip, and I'll sort of talk about feel a little bit here as well, and I guess these go together, so I'll talk about them at the same time. This works really well for light-duty slip jointy tasks. If you want to open a box, score some tape, cut some twine, cut some tomatoes off of a tree, or prune some branches, or just cut through a couple zip ties, things like that. All the kind of little stuff, cut some apples that you would use a slip joint for. This does very well. Easy to grip in a bunch of different positions. Grip up on the blade, grip back here, get your thumb over there. Very comfortable handle. The contouring helps. The big fat flats help make it feel secure in the hand. And the problem is, I have always felt the need to carry a second knife anytime that I have carried the Sharpshooter Jack, because it just doesn't push up into those heavier duty tasks, even in the way that, frankly, something like a Delica can. Like, if I compare breaking down boxes, I would rather break down boxes with a Delica than I would with a Sharpshooter jack. And that has more to do with the ergonomics than the fact that it's a slip joint, because this is a very strong slip joint. The ergonomics are meant and sing really well with light duty tasks. It does start to show the fact that it's a small, relatively neutral handle when you get heavier duty. But the bigger frustration with a slip joint for me, this is a knife that always requires two hands to open. When it is in my pocket and closed, there's no way that I can do it with this. One or two other Jack Wolf knives, I can technically and painfully pinch and open with a single hand, but even then that experience sucks. Frankly, this is a knife that is meant to be opened with two hands. And the problem with that is, when you're used to one-handed opening folding knives, it actually feels like a pain in the butt every single time you got to have both hands available to open your knives. The fact is, again, I'll pull out the Delica because it's another small, lighter duty knife. I can have my left hand occupied with something, be like doing something, carrying something, whatever, pull this out of my pocket and get it ready to go with my right hand without my left hand ever needing to do anything. I quite regularly, when I'm doing stuff and I'm carrying the Jack Wolf Sharpshooter jack, I will want to pull it out of my pocket and just use it, but I've got to put something down first because my left hand will be occupied and I need both hands to open the knife. I don't care quite as much that it's a two-handed closing, because by the time I'm closing the knife, usually I have put down whatever I need to put down and I've got both hands available. Or frankly, you can always do the, put it on your leg and sort of push across the back like that. You can always do that to sort of close it against a part of your body if you really need to close it and you don't have access to both hands. It's a bit sketchy, but you can get used to it once you do it a few times. But the fact is, slip joint knives are cool, they're fun, but there's a good reason that we have generally evolved to locking knives from a functional perspective, because they simply, like, having to open a knife with two hands is simply worse than being able to open a knife with one hand. I will say, the one thing that I love about a slip joint knife is, and I mentioned this before, you don't need to accommodate lock geometry anywhere on this knife. And so part of the reason that this knife is so small and so sort of beautifully designed and consistently designed on both sides, and why it can maximize the shape of this handle, the aesthetics of the handle, the ergonomics of this handle, is you don't need a cutout for a lock here. You don't need a channel for you don't need a lock relief here. You don't need to make this side different to accommodate either a liner lock or a frame lock or anything like that. It's all just consistent with what would be your back spacer if this were a locking knife. So it does help the ergonomics. It does help the aesthetics. And frankly, it even makes it a little bit lighter having this as a slip joint. But I think that is on balance more than offset by the utilitarian frustration of having to have two hands available every time I want to open this knife. So B in utility, B plus in feel, all of which sort of together come down to the fact that this is really, really good at those light duty slicey slip joint tasks, but cannot be a do-everything knife just because of the predictable consequence of it being a slip joint and some of the consequence of that handle design. Carry, I'm going to call an A-. The fact is, when this is folded up, it is a very small, slim object. If you compare this to your small Sebenza, you can see it is about the same size as your small Sebenza. Even looking at it from here, if anything, it is probably, with the contouring, it feels a little bit smaller in the pocket than your small Sebenza. 2.9 ounces for 3¼ inches of blade isn't exceptional, but this really feels like a couple heavy sticks of gum in your pocket. You do feel a sort of weightiness to it because it is a dense object. It's all titanium and steel with just these carbon fiber covers. So it does feel dense, but this can just hide in your pocket very nicely. I do not carry my slip joints in slips. If you choose to carry it in a slip, then very quickly and easily it can take up your entire pocket, which is why I don't carry them in slips. But this carries just fine without a slip. You can drop it into your pocket. It'll fall into the bottom of your pocket, but it's easy enough to fish out. It's an A- because it's not as easy to carry as something with a clip that's always in the exact same place in your pocket. Again, it's the same sort of thing as my complaints with the slip joint, even though, you could make a slip joint with a clip. There's no reason that you can't. But the fact is, it's one of those design choices that it's a little bit more difficult to carry, a little bit more awkward to carry, bounce around in your pocket, things like that, than a knife with a clip, while being a relatively small object that rides nicely in your pocket. I'm going to call it an A- because, frankly, it's been easy enough to carry. But honestly, you know what? I kind of wanted a B+. I kind of want a B+ because it is dense. I do feel it. It's small, but it is dense. And then value, I'm going to call value a B, meaning it's good. The primary thing you're getting with value here is that extremely high level of fit and finish throughout. This is a very, very tightly made knife. Everything is very flush. Everything is very consistent. Everything just sits together very nicely. And so you're paying for knife enthusiast stuff. You're paying for fancy materials. You're paying for that above and beyond level of fit and finish. You're paying for those very pretty blade grinds. You're paying for all that. And the fact is, $300 or $325 for that full experience with S90V, that's $300 these days is unfortunately pretty typical for well-made Chinese knives. And with Riot and Wii locking knives regularly going above $300 now, this feels as well made as anything that Riot makes. This feels that sort of half step above the sort of stuff that Wii makes. $325 feels fair, especially when you consider, getting that custom artwork and stuff like that. That has cost. Over the course of a, 500 knife run, is that cost more than sort of a few bucks a knife? No, but that cost is non-zero. And, getting that slip in there, getting the big cloth that they have, getting the custom artwork on the tin, all of that has cost. $300 for a slip joint in general feels a little expensive, but you do really feel like if you're going to spend $300 on a slip joint, and if you're buying this because of the cool factor, because of the knife enthusiast characteristics, it does feel like they are respecting you as a buyer when you drop $300 on this, and they have done everything they can to make the most of that $300 purchase. It's not a great value, but I have no issue with the price either. So B+ in function. Most of the drawbacks are just fact of the matter for it being a slip joint. But for a slip joint, it is a very functional, very easy to use, very easy to carry knife. And so overall, this is a B+. And the fact is, this knife is kind of exactly what it says on the tin. It's very cool, very fun, very made for knife enthusiasts in 2024. And if that's what you want, then go for it. And you're going to be very, very happy with your Jack Wolf Knives purchases. Now, in my experience, I've owned a bunch of Jack Wolf knives. I got into their first year pretty hot and heavy. Probably owned about 6 of them at various points. I own 3 right now. I will be reviewing this one and the 2 others that I've got. They don't tend to stick around all that long for me, and frankly, part of that is just, again, I'm not a slip joint guy. The functional drawbacks of a slip joint relative to, again, another lightweight locking knife like a Delica, or even, if you want the same level of fit and finish, even a little bit better, a lightweight, a small titanium locking knife like a Sebenza. Like, functionally, the only reason I'm going to carry the Sharpshooter here is because of the cool factor. It is simply less good as a knife than, as like an everyday carry knife, is something to do everything, than your really good locking knives of the same size. For some people that care about the cool factor first and foremost, that, knives are in various ways either pocket jewelry or toys or something to show off or even to be part of a knife community, If you don't care about that, then you're probably one of the people that could be, a candidate to build a nice little Jack Wolf knife collection. But I will say, in my personal experience, I've gotten my Jack Wolf knives. I've used them for a little bit. And my experience has always been sort of, this is good for what it is. This is really well finished for what it is. These ergonomics are very good for what it is. This is very useful for a slip joint. But it's still going to be held back compared to the knives we are used to because of the inevitable characteristics of being a slip joint. And I have never been able to really justify carrying a slip joint regularly, even one as well made and well designed as this. That may be different for you. And lots of people do love to carry their slip joints, and if you are one of those people and you want a modern design slip joint, then Jack Wolf Knives is right up your alley. And frankly, if you're the sort of person that has been watching my channel regularly and you haven't given Jack Wolf Knives a shot, you probably should, because they're doing what they do really, really well. And they've converted a lot of people who never carry slip joints into carrying them on occasion and even building up that little collection. So I love everything that Jack Wolf Knives is doing from a sort of business perspective. Again, I think it's really impressive how well they have managed to manufacture lightning in a bottle in a way, in ways that I am sure are very deliberate and very well planned, while pumping out a bunch of very compelling designs, starting with this Sharpshooter here. It's a very good knife. It's hard for me to generally recommend it, but I think sort of you're going to know looking at it whether you're the sort of person that's going to fall in love with this knife or not, based on the very predictable, assets and drawbacks it has. Those are my thoughts on the Jack Wolf Knives Sharpshooter Jack. Again, as I grow this channel, every like and subscription and every comment down below does help, just sort of helps increase the visibility of this channel and help me sort of frankly justify continuing to make these videos, because they do take a lot of time, they do take a lot of effort, and I'm hoping to, continue to grow that. But anyway, I do hope that this was a good use of your time. I hope that you learned something, or at least were entertained for 46 minutes, or however long you listened for. And I hope you have a great rest of your day. This has been Clark the Knife. Have a good one.